All right, welcome to the Spiral Dynamics Live. Today we have a special guest presenter. He's actually a member of our group, Todd. And Steve actually studied theoretical physics, including string theory, at the Royal Holloway University in London. And what does he do with all that knowledge? He's a software entrepreneur doing amazing things in software, which will not be revealed because it's so secret. But today he's actually bringing to us Buddhism and the spiral. And we've had presentations before on other things in the spiral. So because we believe in diversity, we want to have all viewpoints on the spiral. Anything in the spiral, it's welcome here. So please put your hands together warmly. Welcome, Steve Todd, Buddhism and the Spiral. Woo!
Thank you, Beth. Thank you. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for turning up on a Saturday morning or Saturday afternoon, or whatever it is, wherever you are. So Buddhism and the Spiral. Beth invited me to talk on this after I'd hinted I might be interested to give a presentation on it. I've got about 38 slides here, so I'll not linger too long on any one of them. But it'll probably take about an hour, I'm guessing, the presentation. So, introduction. First of all, I'll give some background to this talk, just some thoughts that how I've approached the talk. I'll try to give a very brief overview of what is Buddhism. I'll delve into looking at the traditions of the schools. Then I'll attempt to look at worldviews and means. So we start to looking at kind of looking at it from a bit of a spiral perspective there. And then finally, I'll be touching on Buddhism and the spiral rather than on the spiral in terms of, are they complementary thought systems, or can they help each other in any ways? And then I have some questions at the end, either for group discussion or breakout rooms. So first of all, health and safety, I should give some caveats around this. This talk. My survey of Buddhism that I'm going to give in this is a very potted survey, kind of quite high level, quite subjective. So apologies to all the Buddhists or anyone who knows anything about Buddhism in this group for all the mistakes I'm bound to make during the presentation. Also, the comments from the spiral dynamics perspective are highly subjective and almost certainly overstretched, but it's worth making some attempt there to look at it from a kind of V-means perspective, value means. And then finally, it's worth saying as well, cultural Buddhism, as it manifests in Buddhist countries, can be quite different in some ways to an individual's personal path. So that's worth taking on board in anything and everything I present here. Okay. So some background. So first of all, then, just the motivation to talk. Why Buddhism and the spiral? When thinking about this, the first question I think, well, why do people get interested in spiral dynamics, and why do they get interested in Buddhism? I think there are some similar topics that maybe attract people to either or both of them. I think they both seem to offer a kind of holistic understanding of the world in some senses. They set out to kind of offer an understanding of behavior and its causes, give some account of values, perception, and maybe even stages, people being at different stages. So in that sense, it's a humanistic and non-judgmental, they're humanistic kind of non-judgmental analyses. They're not particularly judging people for being at any given stage. It's just a sense that there's an understanding that there are causes and conditions, to use some Buddhist terminology there, of why people might hold those particular attitudes or perceptions. And in some senses, they're both, you could almost describe as a kind of, in very loose language, sort of maps of the soul. And certainly that would be kind of, I guess, the direction Ken Wilber would see himself heading in. But there are also some important differences. Spiral dynamics deals pretty much exclusively with humans, human values, culture, society, whereas Buddhism explicitly addresses all sentient life. Spiral dynamics is looking at sort of behavior and cognition, which are sort of understandable concepts in many sense, whereas Buddhism is really looking at the entirety of reality. What is reality? So it's kind of going to some certain deeper philosophical domains. And I would say also that spiral dynamics is a phenomenology. So it's just saying, okay, well, this is how people are, this is how society is. Whereas Buddhism is a kind of soteriology. So it's about salvation in some sense. It's about there's some kind of problem in the world, and there's some kind of answer to that problem. So that's a very key difference, I would say. But having said that, a lot of people who are attracted to spiral dynamics have kind of yellowish leanings, we could say, in spiral dynamics terms, which means they're sort of attracted to a kind of very broad, holistic perspectives. And I think also, certainly in this group, a lot of people have a sense that there are urgent problems in the world that need addressing, and understanding spiral dynamics could maybe help address some of those problems in practical terms. So it's maybe there's a sense of wanting to benefit there is maybe common ground. Okay. The next challenge, and when sort of preparing a talk like this, or even thinking about preparing a talk like this, is how to talk about Buddhism. First sense you get, the more you delve into Buddhism, it's just so vast. So the Buddha taught for approximately 45 years. He died about the age of about 80. So if you think, Jesus only taught for like 3 years or something, that's an awful lot of teaching, and that resulted in an estimated, very, very many thousands of sutras, but anywhere between 20 to 80,000 sutras, which are the sort of core Buddhist teachings. It evolved into a huge number of variant traditions over the following 2,500 years. It produced thousands of saints, adepts, and philosophers, many treatises, formulations, explanations, philosophical schools. But the key thing to note there is that these are all maps, they're not the territories. You could say, why so much variety? And I guess a classic kind of Buddhist response to that would be, is that Buddhist teachings speak to where you are. So it's not a kind of concept system that you're being asked to buy into. It's a kind of a map of where you are and how to get to enlightenment or liberation or whatever it is that you believe Buddhism is offering. Okay, so what is Buddhism? We can see Buddhism really in a few different ways. I think a lot of people would, commonly think of it as being a religion. Certainly it has plenty of aspects which are sort of religious in their appearance. Just a quick question: can anyone put themselves on mute? I think there's some noises coming through. So the religious type expression of Buddhism would be there are holy texts, there are teachings, there's veneration, all sorts of practices, prayers, offering, ritual, temples, vows, monastic communities, hierarchies, and even adopted by some nations and leaders, linked to ethnic identity. So there's plenty there that would kind of support a view of Buddhism as being a religion. But then there's also, we could just say, well, no, Buddhism is just a way of life. And then there's plenty within Buddhism to justify that. So there's the Eightfold Path, which is a charter for how to live your life, though it's not so much a legalistic system as, say, maybe the sort of Abrahamic religions. It's more a set of guiding principles. It has, and growing out of that is respect for all life, gentleness, compassion, kindness, morality, turning away from toxic ego, using a lot of some sort of modern vocabulary here, but non-consumerist, vegetarianism, like-minded community, self-development. So in a Western green type community, I think Buddhism would tend to be seen more as a way of life rather than a religion, whatever. And then certainly you can also see Buddhism as a philosophical expression. So it offers extremely detailed analysis of reality or experience and the human condition. Worldview, it offers a worldview. Points out what it sees as the cognitive defects and illusory views that are part of our condition. It takes a position on ontology and epistemology. It offers a critique of conceptual thought and a conceptual framework to liberate from all concepts. So in that sense, you can, if you choose to, and certainly some Buddhist masters would say, no, Buddhism is a philosophy or a life philosophy rather than a religion. So I just want to kind of clarify here that there's quite a few different ways you can see Buddhism, and in some senses, it's all of these things because different people will be following it in one of these kind of, more or less in one of these kind of ways. Okay, so looking at the origins of Buddhism, it started in the Indian subcontinent 2,500 years ago in what's called the sort of classical era of Buddhism, of Indian civilization. And at the time, there was already very widespread contemplative spiritual practices, some of that dated from the much earlier time of the Vedas and Upanishads, which are still, very, very important kind of cultural and spiritual texts in India today. There are many. There were already sort of many philosophical schools and beliefs. So within that kind of fertile ground, Buddhism arose, and within the Buddha's own lifetime, the community of Buddhists grew quite rapidly, and certainly by his sort of later in the Buddha's life, he was already seen as a kind of prestigious sort of spiritual figure by local kings and so forth, and this was a time also when India was kind of dominated by Brahmanism. So you have the priestly class that had a lot of power, and that kind of meant that then, in some senses, Buddhism was kind of an alternative to Brahmanistic religion. It was more kind of less controlled in that way, or less mediated, and as a result, it spread rapidly through the merchant communities. A big event in the history of the spread of Buddhism was when the Emperor Ashoka, who was the Mauryan emperor, who basically controlled an empire that's most of what we think of as India today, but including also parts of Afghanistan, etc., a very large empire. He converted to Buddhism, so very similar to the kind of Constantine story in some senses there, and the importance of that in the spread of Christianity. So he was then building sort of monuments and sponsored missionary work and monasteries and so forth all over the empire. So that was a very, very important stage in the propagation of Buddhism. I'm not sure that Ashoka himself was that saintly a person, even after he converted to Buddhism. He banned certain things, I think, which you might think of as being coherent with Buddhism, like apparently banned hunting, royal hunting, and might even eventually banned the death sentence. I think after his conversion, he was still torturing and killing a few various people that he saw as heretics. so he's it's not an out and out good character in himself, but in terms of what he did for Buddhism, that was quite huge. And after Ashoka's the sort of fall of the Mauryan Empire, subsequent kingdoms, when it felt fragmented again, support varied, but in certain kingdoms, certain times, there was some very strong support for Buddhism. So in the Kushan and Gandhara kingdoms, later the Gupta and Pala kingdoms, all strongly supported Buddhism. The image on the left is actually, I believe, a Gandharan statue, and this is from the time of what they call the sort of Greco-Indian kingdom. So when the Greeks, the Hellenistic culture, kind of invaded the northwest of India, there was a sort of intermingling. So you can see that this very sort of early sculpture has strong Greek influence in it. And I think this is also interesting in terms of, sometimes we can have the thought or the trope that Buddhism is a very, very exotic Oriental kind of thing. But clearly at the time, there were certain Hellenistic kingdoms in and near India that were adopting Buddhism very wholeheartedly. And then also it's worth saying that Buddhism then spread further due to the Silk Road trade, and spread into neighboring lands, into Central Asia and into China and beyond, basically. So that's a very quick overview there of context Buddhism arose in and the and how it spread. Just a kind of overview timeline there. So I'll probably skip that. I think that's too much detail there. But it's worth saying there's very many ups and downs in the history of Buddhism in India, and that by about the sort of 12th and 13th century, subsequent sort of invasions from initially the Huns and then later the various sort of Muslim empires led to Buddhism being almost wiped out within India, but it continued to thrive in neighboring lands. So the kind of country or area it kind of grew up in almost wiped out there, and then what remained in its place was either Islam or kind of Hindu traditions. Okay. So just to talk a little bit about the life of the Buddha, this is often presented as an important sort of biography or story within Buddhism itself, because it in some senses encapsulates the message that the Buddha, or encapsulates aspects of the message that the Buddha was trying to portray. So he was born as a prince, Prince Gautama Siddhartha, and you could say as a prince he had it all. He had a palatial life with courtesans, you know, luxury, every luxury you could think of at that time. And as the legend or the texts would have it, or some of the texts would have it, his father deliberately tried to protect him from seeing too much of the outside world, because there had been a prophecy that he would either be a great spiritual leader or a great king. And his father, being a king, kind of wanted to carry on in the family tradition, and so thought, okay, well, if I keep him away from too much exposure to sort of suffering and misery and the woes of the world, then he'll just go up to be a king. But by his nature, he was a seeker, and he persuaded his charioteer to take him out of the palace. And then outside, he kind of saw the suffering in the outside world, aging, sickness, death. And he also saw and was intrigued by some ascetic practitioners, people practicing these various self-mortification things. And this obviously played on his mind. And at some point, he basically renounced his worldly situation, and left the palace and went out to take on a religious life, and to basically seek a solution to the suffering and death that he'd seen in the world. There's a period then where he tries out various things. He tries kind of the methods or approaches that were available at the time, various ascetic methods, where there's some very sort of dramatic pictures of him where he's just skin and bones, and you know, self-mortified to the point of almost death, and also various other devotional type practices, also Hindu type practices. But eventually he found those all to be unsatisfactory, and resolved to try a kind of middle path between sensual indulgence and self-mortification, and sat under the so-called bodhi tree, which is like a kind of fig tree, kind of fig tree, and achieved enlightenment, basically. And from that enlightenment, from that seeing reality as it is, he then taught for approximately the next 45 years. And he had, as Buddhists would say, his parinirvana, which is, in common terms, his death, but his kind of exit from the world stage at the age of 80. So he continued to teach well, into his very late years. Okay. So for those who don't know too much about Buddhism, just a quick sort of survey of some of the central tenets. The issue of suffering is key to the whole Buddhist analysis. So it's something that says there's nothing wrong with the world except that we suffer, and that's then leads to analysis of, well, why does this suffering arise? And the Buddha finds that there's basically we live in a state of ignorance to the nature of reality, how reality truly is. And this isn't just sort of a high level concept kind of ignorance. This is sort of deep, almost kind of cognitive ignorance in terms of the way we perceive reality is somehow fundamentally a bit off kilter. And that gives rise to a kind of illusory life, which is called samsara, and which is also a kind of it's illusory, and it's also constantly sort of painful or with suffering. The big sort of teachings that kind of came out very early in the Buddha's teachings were the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. So the Four Noble Truths, I'll jump onto the next slide, but it talks about suffering, and it's often seen to encapsulate the entirety of Buddhist teaching in some senses. It breaks it down into kind of four aspects. The Eightfold Path is a sort of the eight principles of how to live a life that will lead you towards enlightenment. It's a practical set of principles, guiding lights, if you will, that if you follow and cultivate, it will lead you eventually to the same enlightenment that the Buddha had. Refuge is a very, very common, it's not exactly a tenet, but it's a very common, somewhere more like, I guess, like a very foundational method in what are called the three jewels. And the three jewels are the Buddha, the Dharma, which is the Buddha's teachings in this context, and the Sangha, which is the community, the support. And what refuge means here is that you're saying, okay, it's tied up with ideas of renunciation as well. It's the idea that in samsara, in this illusory world, there's no happiness to be found, but without some kind of guidance and teaching, I'm kind of all at sea, I'm all lost. So you look to these three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, as your foundation or your raft or whatever, to help you navigate out of the ocean of samsara. Yeah, and then just some other key concepts. So impermanence is a very, very big topic in Buddhism. This is linked to sort of ignorance, but it's the fact that nothing is ever permanent, and that things are always shifting or changing, and that we have a strong kind of cognitive bias or defect to overlook that, kind of ignore the constantly shifting and changing nature of reality. And then following on from that, additionally to that are the ideas of karma and rebirth, which already existed in Indian society prior to the Buddha, but the Buddha adopts those as part of his explanation of reality. And karma is a sense that every single action we take or perform has a consequence, and the consequence is of the same kind of nature as the action, in some sense, and that it's inescapable. So that whatever you do, in very simple classic terms, if you cause harm, then harm will come back to you. What you sow, so shall you reap. That kind of thing. And rebirth is the sense that that life isn't just this one life. It's not it's definitely not you only live once. It's kind of you live an infinity of lives. Yeah, and I put rebirth rather than reincarnation because there's subtle doctrinal differences there between the Buddhist view and the Hindu view on that, and that they link to this next topic, which is anatman, which means no self. So in most of the Hindu teachings and philosophies, including even some of the kind of non-dual ones, there's this big focus on what they would call atman, and atman for them is the true self, your true essence, which is what carries on between lives. You might call it the soul or something like that, but it will be something sort of permanent and immutable. And the Buddha says, well, it just doesn't exist. You'll never find anything that is the true self and that is permanent and unchangeable, basically. So that's a big divergence between most Hindu traditions and Buddhist traditions there, and a complete core tenet of all Buddhist philosophy and practice, really. And then two of the related concepts. Next is emptiness, and emptiness is emphasized in later Buddhist schools strongly, but it's the notion of total interdependence and no substantial identity, which is that nothing whatsoever can exist but from its own side, independently of everything else. So in some senses, everything is completely interconnected, and therefore you can never, other than as a conceptual designation, you can't ever really point anything out as having its own true identity, because it's completely dependent on everything else, or all causes and conditions. And then in the sort of soteriological sense, the kind of salvational sense, another very interesting aspect of Buddhism is that it basically teaches a fundamental okayness, goodness, that the answer is in your own being, and that the answer to the existential question is being itself. Being is okay, and being is enough, basically. But that's a fundamental sort of sense of being, rather than your current conditions. Your current condition is fully steeped in illusion and samsara, but if you can cut through that, then you find that your more fundamental state, your pure being, if you like, or your being once you've cleared away the confusion, is one that's fundamentally okay and fundamentally good and positive. So there's a kind of salvation, but the salvation is to be found within your own being. Four Noble Truths. This, as I was saying, is often taken as an important summary of all Buddhist teaching, really, and it's the kind of four. It breaks down into kind of four aspects, the whole thought system or the whole approach. And the first is the truth of suffering. This is related to the word dukkha. And you see how I've given two different spellings. This is confusing, can be confusingly. Buddhism has been expressed in several different languages historically. Pali is a language linked to Sanskrit, and that's the one which all the one of the traditions expresses all of its text in, and in some senses the oldest Buddhist texts are in the Pali language. But then later schools kind of use Sanskrit terms. So there's a kind of, I've given both the Pali and the Sanskrit here, but they refer to the same concepts. So the truth of suffering, dukkha. Dukkha can mean anything from merely unpleasant right up to pain, sorrow, distress, grief, and misery. But what the truth of suffering is saying is that within samsara, within the illusory realm, or the illusory life experience, there is always some grit in the oyster. There's always something that's somehow not quite right, and that can vary from just a tiny dissatisfaction right up to incredible distress, grief, and misery. But you'll always be somewhere on that kind of experiential spectrum. And that first of the Four Noble Truths has often led people to characterize Buddhism as a sort of negative or a bit of a sort of downbeat religion or philosophy or whatever. But the way the Buddhists would see this is, no, this is just getting real. This is just being real about what your experience is actually like. Stop kidding yourself, and to use a very sort of modern example of that would be the kind of, it's all these people posting selfies to Instagram and saying, well, are you really as happy as that image you're posting you're posting there? Is that the whole truth? Is that the whole story? So this is really about facing up to what our experience is like in its full, full, not quite gory, but sort of non-made up, non-made over detail. And then from there, the Buddha goes on to point out the truth of the cause of suffering. And this already gets quite deep, really, in the Buddhist analysis. It's going into the kind of fundamentals of our cognitive processes. But but the Buddha is basically saying here that it is our a kind of grasping or greediness in the mind, which leads to this suffering. Basically, that it's this kind of insatiable thirst. In fact, the Sanskrit word Trishna has the same etymological roots as thirst. So it's this thirst, this sort of constant thirst, constant insatiability, constant sort of never, nothing is ever enough. That is basically the kind of the cause, and it's a very, very broad topic in itself that has many sort of lines of analysis, which kind of, once you get into it, kind of endlessly fascinating. But that's probably enough for this purpose. But so okay, so there we know now that the suffering involved in all experience. We know the cause of suffering. At least that's been kind of explained to us. Then the next is the truth of cessation of suffering. This is where I guess it starts getting very upbeat, which is there is actually, we can put an end to suffering because we know the cause, and the cause is not in any way permanent or hardwired, but we can bring an end to this suffering. And that's an end. The word, the Pali Sanskrit word for that is Nirodha, means cessation. But it's not cessation of being, it's merely cessation of the suffering. So there's a state of being that is without suffering, which is the state of the Buddha, the awakened one. And then finally, the truth of the path of cessation, which is the very practical, you can actually spell it out. So rather than just being a nice sort of wishful thinking kind of thing, okay, it's possible, but how the hell do I get there? The Buddha is saying, well, there's actually a path, many paths, to actually get to this point of enlightenment. So that in the four truths there, those four statements, pretty much encapsulates the entirety of the Buddhist system. And then in terms of the truth of the path, in its most fundamental presentation, is set out as the eightfold path. So the eight guiding principles. They are the right view. So you have to try and develop the right understanding, which is a kind of an endless work really up until enlightenment. But it's constantly trying to refine your understanding of initially the teachings, but as you go on, just your own experience and develop your own insights. So this is sort of cutting through the illusion of samsara, really. Right intention, so that's about developing motivation. So without the motivation, it wouldn't be possible really to travel this path. And that's again kind of linked to in some senses to renunciation and to moral kind of subjects. So right speech, so how we conduct our social interactions is important. Right action, so how we conduct ourselves physically in an embodied way in the world is important. Right livelihood, so how we sustain ourselves. So that's again that's a kind of an evolving kind of a sense of what that would be, but in as much as the way you sustain yourself and live in the world should be coherent with your understanding of the world. And right effort, so you're making the right kinds of effort. Something like referred to as like joyous effort, but the right kind of effort to move forward along the path. And then in the last two, we're into sort of meditational domain, so the right mindfulness and the right concentration, samadhi. So those are the kind of 8 guiding principles that if you follow them in a consistent fashion, sort of dharmic, we could say, in a Buddhist way that it's consistent with the underlying view, will eventually take you to enlightenment. So just touching on samsara here, I think there's an interesting parallel an aspect of spiral dynamics coming in already. So in samsara, it's the endless cycle of rebirth. And there are different realms, but in the form realm, there are, it's broken up into kind of six major sub-realms, if you like. So the highest, most pleasant end of experience of samsara is what would be called the God realm, which would be very similar to kind of traditional notions of heavenly type existences. Then there's down from that is what they call the jealous gods, who are a bit more sort of like, demigods, who are a bit kind of warlike in some senses, maybe a bit like the God of the Old Testament, or one of some of the gods of the Old Testament. Those kind of think of the gods of the Middle East in that time. They're sort of, you took your God into war with you, but they're kind of a sort of supernatural life, but they have envy and anger and jealousy. And then there's the human realm, which obviously we know pretty well, and then the animal realm, and then what's called the hungry ghost realm, which is a strongly suffering realm in a way, really, but it's these sort of spirits that have all kinds of afflicted states of being that cause them to suffer quite a lot. One example would be that one of the types of hungry ghost is a being that's forever hungry, but it has only a tiny little mouth, and whenever it eats, food kind of burns its throat as it goes down. So it's sort of, its whole state of being is very, very unpleasant. And then at the lowest kind of level then is hell. So which would be a kind of familiar depiction as we might be used to from other cultural contexts, but a realm of great suffering with constant fires, all sorts of mutilations and so forth. So the key thing in the Buddhist view of this is nobody's doing this to you. There's no external judgment or force or mechanism that is kind of putting you in any one of these states. No, nothing's judging you. These are all manifestations of your own perception of reality, basically. So in some sense, you are creating these realms. And through the successive rebirths, you basically occupy all possible forms of existence, blown along by your karmic wind. So your actions and your views and your prejudices and at a very gross and very deep level, subtle levels, basically kind of force you to wander endlessly round this cycle of these realms. And in some senses, it's kind of infinite. So there's no in the Buddhist view of samsara, there's no inbuilt sense of, oh, I'm progressing, or this suffering is moving me up in terms of understanding or whatever. It's, the view is very much that you could just drift around in the spiral completely endlessly, basically, unless you happen to come upon a spiritual teaching which gets you curious about whether it could be otherwise, whether it has to be like this. And that's, as I said before, samsara is actually a state of mind. It's how we see the world, it's how we are. And that movement through samsara is driven fundamentally by ignorance of the true state of the mind and reality, and then what are called desire and aversion, which are the two more familiar emotional responses that arise as a result of ignorance. They're called afflictive emotions, and they then go up into sort of many more emotions. But those emotions, drive us ever onwards. Counterpoint to that is Nirvana, a word that's very, known in common parlance. I'm not sure how many people know what the word means, really. First thing to say is it's not a Buddhist heaven. Rather, it's the goal of Buddhist practice. And in simple terms, you could say it's the escape from the wheel of samsara. So it's leaving that whole cyclic rebirth, endless cyclic rebirth. It's exiting that process somehow. It's also the experience of a Buddha. So if you become enlightened, then that's same as saying you're in Nirvana. So your experience, how you experience reality as an awakened being, an enlightened being, is Nirvana. That's the statement of it, basically. And it's also a state of mind. So it's the state of mind of a Buddha. So as we as deluded samsaric beings, this is our state of mind. Nirvana is the state of mind of a Buddha. And it's a mind that's reconciled with the reality nature of mind and being. So it's a mind that sees reality as it is, rather than in a misperceived or incorrect way. So it's not subject to ignorance. And even though it's said to be inexpressible, so if you ask a Buddhist to try and define what Nirvana is, other than what I'm saying here, then they won't really be able to tell you. They can't say, it's like sometimes when you ask Christians what heaven would be like, they say, oh well, there's a God sitting there on a throne with a long beard, and you can't really, in Buddhism, you can't really even attempt to say anything like that, because it's said to be inexpressible, the experience. But in trying to approach the experience, some words that are kind of used are, I think, like blissful, infinite, spontaneously compassionate, omnipotent, omnipresent, unlimited, vast openness. Those are the kinds of words that are said to kind of get closest to something of what Nirvana is like as an experience. So traditions. Just said before, Buddhism is split into very many schools and lineages. The major traditions that are usually identified are Theravada, which, if you've ever been to sort of Thailand or Southeast Asia, that's one of the major Buddhist traditions there. Mahayana, which is Chinese, and also includes Tibetan and Japanese forms of Buddhism as well. And then in Mahayana's more specialized expressions, Zen and Adriana. Each of these major traditions emphasizes different aspects of the teaching. They have different kind of aesthetics, different appearances, different practices, but they would all recognize the core sutra teachings. So Theravada pretty much only recognizes the sutra teachings, and then the other traditions would recognize other texts as also having authority, texts that historically may have come later but are seen as authentic, and usually an explanation is given that they were, secret texts or whatever. There's lots of explanations, but there's a difference in acceptance of scriptural textual authorities amongst the different traditions, and differences in emphasis. And they're linked to, and then within those traditions, you have schools and lineages. So even within Theravada, or within Mahayana, or within Zen or Vajrayana, you'll have particular schools and so-called lineages. And those are linked usually to founding individuals, philosophical positions, specific practices, or particular focus or emphasis, and also, as I said, the extended textual authorities. But in all of them, lineage is key. So you can't rock up tomorrow and really set up your own Buddhist school or lineage, because the idea is it's meant to be an unbroken chain from master to student all the way up to the Buddha, basically. So unless your teacher is who needs to be an enlightened teacher recognizes you as an enlightened or highly realized student, then you wouldn't have the lineage authority really to establish your own tradition. And on the whole, the different traditions, and this is probably varied over history, but aren't really seen as problematic within Buddhism, because of this sense that individuals are at different places and need different things, and that the different traditions present in a different way. And certainly as a kind of approaching the Western Buddhist, where you to some extent you can kind of pick and choose, there are benefits from all the traditions and their presentations. So just to go through those very quickly. So Theravada literally means the school of the elders. Geographically, it was originally out of India, as did they all. And then it's now in Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, Myanmar. The key texts are the Tipitaka, so the 3 collections of texts, basically, that's kind of core to them in the Pali language. That would include the sort of sayings of the Buddha, the Abhidharma, which is the kind of philosophical commentaries, and the Vinaya, which is the rules for the monastics. And amongst those, the Metta Sutta, which is the Mettabhava Sutta, which is the development of compassion, and the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, which is the 4 foundations of mindfulness, are key sutras. And the Dhammapada is a collection of sort of sayings of the Buddha, which is also a key text. And finally, the Visuddhimagga, which is a commentary on the path to sort of the kind of coherent presentation of the Theravadan view, basically, in the philosophical positions. Jumping around. Emphasis is on mindfulness in Vipassana meditation, strict moral conduct, restraining from acting out on desire or hatred, and developing loving kindness. And practices, key practices would be refuge, so taking refuge in the Buddha, which is kind of part of renunciation, recitation of sutras, mindfulness in Vipassana meditation, moral conduct, alms seeking, so they'll go out with their bowls to beg for alms on a daily basis, and meditation retreats. Okay. And apologies to the Buddhists or people with a lot of exposure to Buddhism in the audience. These are very high-level sketches. But then moving on then to the Mahayana tradition. So Mahayana literally means the great vehicle. Maha is great and Yana is vehicle. And so what do you mean by vehicles? A vehicle is the idea is that the tradition, the collection of texts and practices and so forth is like a vehicle that's carrying you along the path towards enlightenment. And sometimes pejoratively, the Mahayana is contrasts itself with Theravada, and we call it Theravada Hinayana, meaning the small vehicle. And I'll explain why that would be the case in just a moment. So the geography is just India, again, to start in India, and then spread to Nepal, Tibet, China, Korea, Vietnam, Singapore, and Japan. And the emphasis is very much on compassion and emptiness. So it tends to think of itself as having a much vaster view of the path and enlightenment, the practice, than Theravada. So the Mahayana kind of perspective would depict Theravada as being overly concerned with your own personal salvation, or your own personal liberation and enlightenment, whereas kind of cornerstone of the Mahayana tradition is that you want all beings to become enlightened. You want to save all beings from the ocean of samsara, to liberate all of them. And to the extent you even want them to achieve liberation before you. You want to be like the shepherd bringing the sheep in, where they all get in safely before you close the gate. So that's the big kind of contrasted difference. The key texts here are basically unknown to the Theravada. So there's the Heart Sutra, and which comes from the Prajnaparamita Sutras, so that's the perfection of wisdom. And these are all considered to have been written much later, though the tradition says that they still have a lineage to the historical Buddha. And also the Bodhisattva Charyavatara, which is the guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life. So in the Mahayana, the Bodhisattva ideal becomes key, and it's the idea that you're a trainee Buddha, that you're training to become a Buddha. And to some extent, you could say this strong emphasis on sort of outwardly directed motivation to benefit all beings is an expedient means to overcome self-grasping, which is kind of identified as one of the core problems to overcoming ignorance. And the key practices here, again, will be refuge, but the 4 kind of great expansive wishes to that all beings should be free from suffering, they should be happy, They should all have kind of light and bliss and obtain great equanimity. Recitation of the Heart Sutra, mantra recitation, visualization. So already here now they start introducing visualization of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas as a means to progress yourself spiritually. Reflection and meditation, compassionate conduct. Okay, and now touching on Vajrayana, which is the predominant form of Buddhism in Tibet. So it means the adamantine vehicle. So Vajra is diamond and Yana is vehicle. Geography, it started in India again, and spread to Nepal, parts of Central Asia, and then into Tibet, Bhutan, Mongolia, and a little bit in Japan. It's really a tantric specialization of Mahayana. So it doesn't see itself as distinct from the Mahayana. It sees itself as a kind of specialization of the Mahayana. As a vehicle, it sees itself firmly rooted in the Mahayana view, the vast sort of compassionate view. But it places a strong emphasis on skillful means to accelerate the path to enlightenment, and places a strong importance on guru devotion. So the guru comes really to the forefront in Vajrayana. It becomes an absolutely essential part of the practice. Key texts are the Tantras, again, sort of not really known outside that much of Vajrayana, some crossover with earlier Mahayana, but kind of, again, a specialized set of texts. Sadhana practice texts, so these take the form of kind of almost like a deity worship, but the deity is really an expression of your own Buddha potential, so that has to be clarified there. And lots of commentaries and treaties that go along with those. So I said there, the practice is these pujas, attending teachings of a guru, tantric initiations, guru yoga, foundational nundro practice, so-called, which is lots of prostrations and lots of some specific meditational practices, purification, and then further along the path, tantric and yogic practices, working with energy, kundalini energy, practice to directly realize the nature of mind, which are referred to as Dzogchen and Mahamudra in different branches of Vajrayana. And in terms of the aesthetic, and if you stumble in on a kind of a temple where they're practicing Vajrayana, it'll be very different than if you stumble in on say a Theravada temple. So it's very, very appears highly ritualistic and magical to some extent. It's kind of almost like purple type memes coming out there strongly, or turquoise in a spiral dynamic sense. So it's quite a distinct expression. And then I'll just touch on Zen briefly. I know less about Zen than the others probably, but Zen is the Japanese word, which is the translation of the Chinese word Chan, which just means meditation, basically. So Zen just means meditation. And the geographies are China, it started in China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and now obviously also the USA. It originated in China from about 400 CE and developed through to about 900 CE, particularly in the Tang dynasty. Hello? It was founded by a figure called Bodhidharma, who probably came from Central Asia. He was referred to as the blue-eyed barbarian. And he arrived in China in the early 5th century. It's linked also to the Shaolin Temple of Kung Fu fame. And Bodhidharma famously meditated for 9 years, just facing a wall in a cave after being refused entry into the temple. So here we can see some Zen monks kind of in a way imitating that behavior, just facing the wall to do their Zazen practice, which just means sitting meditation. They also famously contemplate koans, which are these sort of, sort of logical paradoxes, which are considered helpful in the cultivation of wisdom. They perform mindful work, interviews with the teacher, so a kind of guru system is also important in the Zen tradition, and radical simplicity and sort of rigor of self-control are big themes as well within Zen. Okay, so progress on the path. All major Buddhist traditions have a notion of progress as you move along the path. But what does this look like? Initially, it looks like interest or faith in the teachings, improved self-conduct, more compassion, and probably more self-acceptance. And it moves on to kind of mental and emotional regulation, inner peace, better sleep even. Changes in understanding. Reality becomes less concrete, broader perspectives, then start evolving insights, experience, moving on to mastery of meditation practices, even developing super mundane powers, which are called siddhis, but sort of clairvoyance, that type of thing, so that's what the teachings say. And then finally stabilizing that experience and insight, and moving up through the so-called 10 grounds of the Bodhisattva until you achieve complete liberation. So that's just one presentation. There are very many presentations, but all the traditions have a sense that there are kind of stages or progress along the path to complete enlightenment. And what's the essence of this progress? Well, at the beginning, I think it's very familiar. It's effort. You have to make an effort to progress with it. You have to put the time in. You have to accumulate in some senses. So maybe accumulation here can mean accumulating kind of exposure to the teachings, teaching from different teachers or reading different texts, etc. And also evaluation, so putting the effort to compare that with your reality. So there's a strong emphasis on you have to see it to be true for yourself. Don't just take it because I'm saying it. Check it out, basically. So you have to do that work to check out the teachings. Then moving on from there, the next stage is typified by purification, mind training. So there are lots of practices to basically train your mind. And in here, you're kind of moving into a kind of fake it till you make it type approach. So there's lots of practices where you're starting to train your mind to sort of almost to kind of start feeling like a Buddha, if you see what I mean. And connecting would be kind of connecting with your own inner potential there. So it's about basically making this personal and real for yourself. And at the end, progress is really about letting go, being free from concepts, and remembering your own true nature. And that's the big sort of change in some senses, because we would tend to think of progress or any kind of striving for a goal as being something very grasping or kind of, there's a sense of effort there. At the end, it becomes actually about relaxation, letting go of everything, letting go of conceptual thoughts and views, and remembering that your own true nature is this Buddha nature. Okay. Just a quick note on there on the different texts and authorities. So the different traditions, there's three major different collections of texts: the Pali texts, which are key to the Theravada tradition, Chinese texts, and the Tibetan texts, which are key to Mahayana and Vajrayana. And I'll jump over this next. So we're running on time, but there's a whole range of texts of different types. And I'll touch on the last one there, which is the termas. So within the Tibetan tradition, there's even this sort of, to give you a sense of how kind of magical it is. So there are these types of lamas who are called tertans or treasure finders, and they find new texts which are either kind of hidden in mountains or even said to be hidden in their own mind. So the text can just pop up in their mind. And from a Theravadan point of view, that would look very suspect, but within the system of Tibetan Vajrayana, it has its own kind of logic, which makes perfect sense. But yeah, so that's one of the more unusual textual authorities or ways of coming up with new texts and practices that exist within the Vajrayana. Okay, so now beginning to look at it a bit from a kind of spiral dynamics perspective. What are the worldviews and memes? So the worldviews and memes from the three different major traditions, or the three vehicles perspective. So all vehicles share a broad cosmology, for the sense that there's many planets. Buddhism is belief that there's life throughout the universe, there's other realms, there's like formless realms. Said we have this within the form of the 6 realms, so the God realm all the way down to the hell realm, etc. So all the vehicles basically share that view, and a lot of that's actually carried over from older Indian beliefs and thoughts and notions, etc. And all vehicles value self-discipline, morality, study, self-development, so kind of classic blue memes in spiral dynamics language. And all vehicles accept the occurrence or possibility of supramundane powers and supernatural abilities. You could say that's sort of purplish, but I think maybe from the public kind of point of view, it could be, but I would say within Buddhism's way of seeing it, would be very much sort of turquoise and beyond type memes there. Okay. And at this point, it's worth pointing out that within Buddhism, it's often said that the highest view is no view at all. So that the value system, or the view, your perspective you're trying to kind of move towards, is one that's basically free of any fixed position, and that you're meeting each moment completely fresh as it arises, basically. So that's an important point to state, particularly as I'm now going to go and do a bit of a values assessment on the different vehicles. So the general world view, shared by all the vehicles, we've touched on in various points already for this presentation, is that beings in samsara are in a dream. They're in this illusory state of reality. They've somehow misperceive it at a very fundamental level. And that's to do with seeing things as independently existing and having some kind of permanence. That in its turn gives rise to self-grasping, identifying and disturbing emotions, the kleshas, which are then identified strongly as I, me, and mine, to this illusory self. So they're attached to this illusory self. That in its own turn creates a kind of pressure to act on what's arising from an emotional basis, which then creates karma. Karma creates unwanted consequences, which leads to more negative emotions, more actions, more unwanted consequences, and that then basically creates the whole wheel of samsara. Okay. Also, there's a sense that beings are composite, so there's nothing unitary about us. We're made of parts. Our mind's made of parts, like our normal idea of mind is made of various kind of factors and parts. We have our bodies are obviously made of parts, and therefore inevitably we must die. So death is an absolute certainty within the Buddhist view. But the karma basically acts on consciousness. So even though our body must die, the karma will continue to act on consciousness after everything falls apart, and that then causes us to be born again, like a new dream arising after the previous one ends. Okay, so looking at some of the memes here, I think we could say place, and this is kind of very subjective and very thin analysis in some sense, or overstretched analysis. You could sort of say that Theravada is coming from a blue meme, traditional. So it's very much about respect, formal conduct, morality, self-restraint, reducing sensual desire, so kind of stoicism. And its goal is to become an arhat, so not even to become a full Buddha, as you might say. Language becomes very delicate at this point, but that is effectively, the full Buddhas are very, very rare, and the enlightenment for following this is a sort of a slightly lesser version, which is it's referred to as arhat, which just means a worthy one. But yeah, but it means enlightened, but just not somehow the same as a full Buddha. And within Theravada societies, monastics are held in have very high social status. So within the Mahayana, I think we can see this as being kind of green means in many senses. The emphasis on compassion for all beings, the bodhisattva ideal as almost like the perfect good guy, who's prepared to even sacrifice his own life for the benefit of others. Interestingly, though, this maybe it kind of steps a bit out of the green here, is there's a sense of cosmic Buddhas and bodhisattvas are also subjects of veneration. So there are many more Buddhas and kind of cosmic bodhisattvas added to the whole pantheon. So that's probably moving kind of definitely into tier 2 territory there. They position rebirth in the Pure Land. So all these cosmic Buddhas and bodhisattvas have a so-called Pure Land, which is like a sort of a kind of heaven within, somewhere located within samsara, but that's meant to be optimal for your own spiritual progression. And that if you pray, or supplicate these cosmic Buddhas and bodhisattvas, then you can be born next life in one of these Pure Land destinations. And it's a kind of intermediate destination on the way to full Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. And then in looking at Vajrayana, I'd say at first glance it looks very purple, but I think you have to take it from its own way it states itself, that it's really definitely a kind of turquoise or something higher than that. So it looks shamanic, very esoteric, mystical, magical, highly ritualistic. It has an even bigger pantheon than the Mahayana. It includes wrathful deities, so these things that look like kind of hellish kind of demons are actually meant to be kind of expressions also of enlightenment. So it's even more kind of holistic in that sense. And the practices would also include prayers to semi-mundane protectors and offerings to spirits. So there's a strong magical sense here that there are these supernatural forces at play within samsara, beyond our kind of normal rational kind of mind, and that they also need supplicating or appeasing or kind of living happily alongside to some extent, and that they can also be beneficial to your practice. It makes very heavy use of dramatic symbolism and ritual objects, mudras, these hand gestures and ritual dance. But behind it is a very, very subtle worldview. And Vajrayana is very explicitly clear that all of this show is symbolic, basically, to make the connection between the outer and the inner world. And the realization of your Buddha nature right here and now is both the path and the destination. So in that sense, it's considered to be a very accelerated path, but it's the path is the destination to some extent. So looking at means for how Buddhists might live in the world, we talked a lot about spiritual practice and maybe things abstracted from the world. But there are recommendations about how you might live in the world. We saw some of that already in the Eightfold Path. But really, the way you're encouraged to, or what you're encouraged to focus on, kind of means you're encouraged to adopt, evolve with your level of engagement in Buddhism and the Dharma, and also with your inner development. So absolutely foundationally, you're encouraged to take responsibility for your own actions, and that actions have consequences. And this is a sort of completely foundational starting point. So that could range, depending on who you're saying that to, that could range memes-wise anywhere from beige through to blue. But it's understanding that actions are not free of consequences. That then kind of evolves into respect for conventions and conventional society, and also higher values beyond your own personal desire for satisfaction, gratification. So I would say that kind of sits within a blue meme kind of space. Also the importance of morality and study, so that sort of blue-orange kind of memes there. And then moving on to kind of developing care, attentiveness, compassion, and wisdom. So this is a sort of a kind of refinement of your self-development of your own capacities and competencies. And you could see that depending on how you take that guidance. You could see it in kind of an orange or a green type of way. Certainly, I think some people would see it as a kind of, you know, very much kind of self-development track there. Others would see it in a more kind of green type of way. Then next kind of most important aspect then is basically calming and knowing the mind, and everything up until this point you could say is almost sort of foundational. Until you've got all that sorted, you can't really begin the important work of meditation to some extent, or deeper meditation. But then once you get there, it now becomes the kind of key topic becomes kind of calming the mind down from its usual agitated state and getting to know the mind, getting very familiar with the workings of your own mind. And this could, you know, again, depending on how you take that, this could be sort of orange, green, or already moving up into kind of yellow type means. And then from there, I've put this one in. It's not so much in traditional teaching, but I would say authenticity becomes big, and this is about kind of cut the crap, basically cut the bullshit. Stop pretending to yourself. Stop. You know, it's in psychological terms. We sort of, you know, drop your kind of, to some extent, drop your kind of public identity or your persona you keep kind of playing out publicly, and actually be as authentic with yourself as you possibly can be about your you know, perspective, your view, what's happening, and also stop projecting onto others as well. So that's kind of, I would say in the way I'm describing, I'd say that's kind of moving up into sort of yellow and turquoise kind of territory. And then freedom from worldly concerns. So to live in the world free of worldly concerns is an interesting conundrum, but that's again an important recommendation within Buddhist teachings. And again, that's, I would say, sort of firmly up in yellow, turquoise territory, if you can properly engage with it. So just on that last point, what are worldly concerns? Well, really, it's any belief or behaviour that's based on the wrong view. So it's anything where you're sort of saying, okay, there's something in some side, something in this world out there that's going to make me fine, it's going to make me happy. The answer's out there in the phenomenal world, rather than to be found in your own being or your own nature. And anything that keeps us looking out into the world, chasing mirages. And that's sometimes formulated as what are called the 8 worldly concerns. So to be a hedonistic level, the desire for pleasure and the fear of pain, and desire for gain and fear of loss, desire for praise and the fear of blame, and the desire for fame and the fear of insignificance. And you know, if we analyze a lot of our daily actions, most of them will kind of come under or be influenced by one or more of those typically. So just the introspection, just to understand that process, can be quite fascinating. Okay, and then just want to talk a little bit about renunciation, because it's a big concept in Buddhism. It was modeled, you know, by the Buddha leaving the palace and going out, turning away from his kind of very comfortable samsaric life, and going out to try and find an answer, to seek, you know, a spiritual path. It's really considered a sort of like a key theme in properly connecting with the spiritual path within Buddhism. But it means different things in the different vehicles and in the different, or it's often expressed in different ways in different vehicles and the different levels. So in the Theravada, which is the more sort of traditional kind of thing, renunciation is primarily about turning away from sensual pleasures and the kind of, you know, ordinary life, if you might express it that way. That might be a kind of quite blue-orange expression of it, very kind of similar to Stoicism. And Stoicism itself was possibly influenced originally from some Buddhist ideas. There was that interchange between Buddhist and Hellenistic cultures. Then within the Mahayana, you could maybe say that renunciation becomes kind of gets a different tilt on it, and it becomes related more to compassion for all beings. So it's renouncing your self-grasping, renouncing your habitual tendency to place yourself as the most important person in the universe, and actually looking out and seeing there's an infinity of beings out there. So that's a kind of renunciation in the Mahayana tradition, to overcoming that self-grasping, and also insight into emptiness. So renouncing your view of the world as being kind of solid and real in the way we typically take it to be, and seeing its kind of empty nature. So I would say that's in a kind of green-yellow meme kind of space there. And then finally, within Vajrayana, renunciation can maybe be characterized as an attitude, the attitude that your fundamental being has always been Buddha nature, and that samsara and nirvana are one. They're one and the same thing. It's merely a perspective difference. That's possibly the hardest to explain, but it makes sense from within the Vajrayana perspectives. And that's clearly up in sort of yellow turquoise territory there. Okay. I'll sort of, for the purposes of time, I'll skip this one here, but I was looking at some countries that are Buddhist, where Buddhism is kind of prevalent, and just thinking about, okay, what's their material, cultural situation, what possible meme spread is there. But if you think about, say the difference between Nepal, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Myanmar, Japan, South Korea, whatever, they're all in very different stages of material development. But Buddhism, thrives in those contexts despite those variants in background means. So I think it's kind of clear, at least to me, that Buddhism doesn't require some specific mean configuration to be able to thrive culturally. Okay. I just want to quickly look at sort of Buddhist institutions on the spiral. So in the East, monasteries, I think, are primarily blue. The status they hold in society, it's very much about that's the tradition, that's the society, that's the culture. But within the monasteries, the philosophical study and so forth is easily up into kind of yellow level thinking. Temples are maybe for the public kind of in the purple kind of space, about connecting with myth and that kind of mythic type meaning, but also blue for tradition, and even green in terms of a broader coming together, where people from across society and even from outside the society will be welcome and can meet on kind of common ground there. The different schools and lineages, again, it's sort of in that kind of blue-orange space, but at the higher end, the differences between the schools and lineages, you can only really understand maybe the kind of yellow turquoisey kind of space. And then I would say retreat centers, which are a big part of Buddhist practice, are also up in that yellow turquoise kind of space, because if you're engaging with it, the kind of work you're doing there is certainly beyond the first tier means, for sure. I'll contrast that now with the West. So I think in the West, Sangha, the community, the Buddhist communities, are anywhere between sort of purple, green, and turquoise, really. I would say the kind of more new agey participants in Sangha might be fulfilling kind of purple needs. There's certainly a strong kind of green vibe in a lot of Buddhist Sanghas, a lot of those green views, which can be expressed quite strongly. So get kind of, maybe when you're seeing it more as a kind of way of life type thing, and ties in, maybe for something with progressive politics or whatever. And then there are definitely Western practitioners who are already engaging in yellow, turquoisey types of thought, I would say. And then Buddhist centers, I would put the center of gravity there, probably around orange green, so self-development. A lot of them double up as kind of yoga centers and therapy centers, massage, whatever. So they're in that kind of value space, though obviously they probably stretch out further downwards and upwards. And then I want to include online, because a lot of Buddhism is going online now. So lots and lots of teachings are being made available, lots of broadcasts of rituals and ceremonies and so forth being broadcast online. And that's quite fascinating, because then it's you can engage with it more directly from where you are. And I think that actually shifts maybe how they present kind of meme-wise. So the broadcast of ceremonies and rituals are, blue for people who are coming in that way, but they can also be mediating, green or turquoise type experiences. And the online teachings, I would say, are definitely in the sort of orange, yellow kind of memes there, around either kind of on a self-development track or very much trying to kind of get quite deep into Buddhist philosophy and some of the more subtle practices. Okay. So we're getting close to the end now, if anyone's fatiguing out there. Buddhism in the spiral. So I just wanted just a couple of slides just to see it from each perspective, basically. So how would Buddhism see spiral dynamics, or can we build with integral theory, or whatever? I think the first question it would ask is it beneficial? And to that, you could maybe answer yes. You could say it helps us cultivate an understanding of human society, in a non-judgmental way, that's kind of has a cognitive or psychological basis, so in that sense it also promotes an understanding of the constructed nature of culture and society, and it's also accented towards, certainly the groups, towards an understanding that we might benefit. I think a lot of people would like to use spiral dynamics and integral theory to try and benefit the world or benefit others. And you could say, well, that's well aligned with the bodhisattva motivation. And also the kind of depiction of tier 2, the yellow and turquoise memes, introduces topics and themes that are very much at the core of Buddhist concern. So I think you would see it as quite useful in sort of introducing people to those topics and areas of investigation. You might also see an analogy with the six realms and the stages. So the six realms within Buddhism, within samsara, but the stages. But that's obviously not within Buddhism. That's not a kind of linear progressive thing, or you can't really, other than that some are kind of very pleasant, some are very hellish. You can't really say that one's superior because they're all within samsara there. That's the limit of that analogy. I think Buddhism would also say that spiral dynamics is a phenomenology, but not a path. So it doesn't kind of necessarily lead you anywhere. And it would also ask, is spiral dynamics true, or is it just an expedient explanation? How could we determine its validity? And it would point out that it's not an answer to personal or universal suffering. Obviously, Ken Wilber got very interested in Buddhism at some point, and he's tried to incorporate that within his system. And to some extent, you could say he's done it in a sort of a limited way, in as much as he's included a line. And he's sort of, I would say, borrowed a lot of concepts and terminology or technology from Buddhism. But very much kind of wanted him to fit it into his scheme, I think, and part of his drive for ultimate coherence. And you could say he brings it into a sort of self-development framework. So for people who are interested in developing spiritually and also in other dimensions, that might be an interesting approach. But I read one interview, which I can share on the chat later, with a Buddhist publication that asked him, what can knowing your philosophy do for the advancement of consciousness? To which Ken Wilber replied, not very much, frankly. Each of us still has to find a genuine contemplative practice. So I thought that was an interesting and a somewhat provocative quote. So are Buddhism and spiral dynamics complementary? Well, they're coming from different places, and they have a different analysis, and they have different domains of concern. But I think plenty of people within the spiral dynamics community are interested in self-development, which possibly includes spiritual development as well. So there might be some fertile ground there. So that brings me to the end of the presentation, and the questions I have for either everyone or the groups, if you do breakout groups, are do you see spiral dynamics and Buddhism as compatible or even complementary? Is Buddhism or a similar spiritual practice an essential addition for anybody looking to use spiral dynamics as part of self-development work, or applies to the Wilber's integral kind of stuff as well? Can Buddhism throw any light on how each level can express itself healthily, which is a common question that comes up in spiral dynamics discussions? And then finally, does second tier have any meaning without spiritual practice? Okay, thank you. Thank you for your patience.